Hello.
Good morning.
To begin with, could I ask you to say your name and
Yes.
where you were born?
Yes, my name is Thuan Kien. I was born in Saigon, Vietnam.
And when were you born?
The exact date is February 16, 1963.
So, just to set the context, could you tell us a little bit about your life in the final, in the lead up to the end of the war? So, 1975.
Sure. My parents, I guess, where I could start from. My parents were both born in the north of Vietnam. My mom in Hưng Yên, my father in Hà Nam. They did live in Hanoi, and eventually they moved south in 1954. They met in Saigon, and they had me in 1963. And subsequent to that, I have three more brothers. They were born from 1964 to 1969. So my beginning was in Saigon. Well, this might be interesting. At that time, it's quite rare for a premature baby to be born and to survive. So from what I was told, probably I was at 26, 27 week gestational age. So when I was born, most likely I was under 1 kilogram, and I fit into my dad's palm, and that's what I was told. And I survived, which is quite rare at that time. I did all my schooling from kindergarten in a St. Paul Catholic school. Subsequent to that, I went to Lake Widon up till grade 6. And we left Vietnam, and my dad was in the Navy. He was a high-ranking officer in the South Vietnamese naval group, and we live in a naval compound in Saigon. It's called Hải quân Công xưởng. So my childhood was quite I guess, unremarkable for living in a war-torn country. Saigon, from my recollection, was quite safe up till the very end when there was a bombing in the presidential palace. That was the very first sign of the war that I experienced firsthand. Of course, there were pictorial evidences of the war on TV, but the presidential bombing was quite a significant event. Our home was quite close to the presidential palace, and we heard the bombing. Soon after that, school was cut short because of the war, and we left on the night of April 29th, 1975. Living in the naval compound, my dad, due to his responsibilities, we left along with other officers and their families, of course with my family. Extended family, we were one of the lucky ones. My dad was able to get my maternal grandparents, my maternal uncle and aunts, as well as his my paternal grandmother and some of my paternal uncle and aunts. So we were one of the lucky ones to have left Vietnam with an extended family. So we were quite grateful for that. We left on a Vietnamese battleship in a fleet with the understanding from my dad's point of view that the Navy would gather in a coastal island called Gonson, and the Navy would have returned for more fighting days. However, on the morning of April 30th, we heard on the news that Saigon fell, and the North Communists had entered the presidential palace, so there was no reason for us to return anymore, and we kept on to the Philippines.
Can we stop? Can we go back a bit and just a little bit in your story? The ship that you were on, was your dad the commander of the ship?
My dad was the, I'm not sure what the exact term, the Vietnamese term is Hải đội trưởng. So he was a commander of the whole fleet, actually. So the ship that we were on were not his ship that he would captain. He commanded the whole fleet. So the ship that we were on was one of his fleet that was under him.
And on that ship, how were other families of other crew members? Were they also on board?
Absolutely. In the final days of the war, living in a naval compound, all families, all officers were basically quarantined in the naval compound. There were officers who had family outside the compound, so unfortunately they did not have the chance to bring their family in. With my family, with our family, we were lucky. We were living inside the naval compound, and my dad had the ability to bring in family members. So when we left, everyone within the naval compound would have gone on to different ships to move forward. Yeah.
And how many people were on your ship?
I was quite young. I cannot recall the exact numbers, but there were a lot. Imagine a huge battleship, and people were everywhere. I mean, a normal battleship would have the crew, and now you think with their family, that size would be increased 10 times, 20 times the normal numbers. So from my recollection, it was quite massive. A lot of people had to, they don't have sleeping quarters, proper sleeping quarters, so they would have makeshift sleeping quarters inside I guess the ship hull, on top of the deck. So people were everywhere. My aunt, my paternal aunt, just gave birth to my little cousin, and I remember that my dad and my aunt were searching for baby's formula. So it was quite traumatic for, I'm sure, all the involved adults. For us little kids, you know, we were with our family, so we were, from my recollection, were stress-free. But I'm sure it was quite traumatic to my parents and other family adults.
You were 12 years old at the time.
I was 12 years old. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yes, continue.
Mm-hmm. So on the next day, April 30th, 1975, we basically became stateless. We lost the war. We did not want to remain in a communist country, so we were stateless, and we were entering the Philippine water. From what I was told, it was quite an ordeal. It was quite a negotiation between the South Vietnamese fleet through U.S. officials to enter the Philippines, because obviously the Philippines did not want to accept us, Vietnamese refugee, because they would have to deal with the Vietnamese government.
So can you continue from the 30th of April?
So on the morning of April 30th, we heard on the radio news that Saigon had fallen and the communists, the North, had entered the presidential palace, so there was no reason for us to return. The initial intention was to return to have more fighting days, but the reason was now gone, so we had to keep on forward to the Philippines. It was quite, from what I was told, it was quite a negotiation between the South Vietnamese fleet and the Philippine government. Obviously, the Philippine government would not want to be involved with the Southern Vietnamese fleet, who were no longer in existence. So we were stateless. And so we had to negotiate with the U.S. official assistant. So we entered the Philippines using U.S. flag, using U.S. umbrella. So all the ship had to remove the yellow flag with the 3 stripes and hoist up the American flag. And all the Vietnamese wording on the ship had to be painted. So no signs of a Vietnamese ship would be visible. These ships were initially purchased from the U.S. government. So when we docked in Subic Bay in the Philippines, we returned the ship to the U.S. Officials, and then we were transferred onto tankers. If you would imagine huge tankers carrying fuels and all the elements.
So how big was the fleet that left Vietnam?
I was quite young. I was 12, so I would not know the exact numbers. My best guess would be between 20 to 30 ships. So it was a significant number of ships that enter the Philippines, and eventually all those people had to be transferred onto several tankers. And from the Subic Bay, we left for the American islands of Wake and Guam in the Pacific. We would left the ships and enter into American Army camps. And there, we would stay for a good 2 months. So imagine life on a Pacific island and army camps for 2 months. For us little kids, it was quite an adventure. We had nothing to do except going to the beach, play with the sand and beach. However, one thing that I recall quite vividly were the sea urchins. They were sea cucumbers, so they were huge and they were everywhere, and it was really yucky to step on them. So that's quite vivid in my mind up to this day. And up to this day, I do not want to see another sea cucumber. However, life on a Pacific island for us young kids was quite easy. We just have our playing days in the sand. When we would be hungry, we would return to the mess hall for our food. My first experience of lining for food was at Guam Island. Massive numbers of people would line up for breakfast and lunch and dinner every day. And to keep the people, I guess, under a happier environment, the U.S. government would provide movies. Huge screen and movies would be shown at night. And life would be repeated in that manner for 2 months. Living in these army camp in the hot days of summers. From that days, there were global movement to accept these refugees. The American took the most refugees. My dad did some schooling through the Navy on U.S. soil, and he was in the Navy, so obviously he would have been able to stay in the U.S. So from Guam Island, we were flown to Camp Pendleton in California around July 1975. We stayed at Camp Pendleton for 2 weeks. We could have stayed, but my dad decided to move forward to Toronto, Canada.
Why did he want to go to Toronto?
I guess many thoughts were on his mind. Being U.S. trained, he would have an easier life in the U.S. But having 4 boys going through a war, I am sure that was on his mind as well. He would not want his 4 boys to be drafted into the war machinery. And also, at that time, most of my maternal family side, most of them spoke French. Most Vietnamese people spoke French as a second language at that time. So they had opted to move to French Canada, to Montreal and Quebec province. So to reunited my maternal family side. And also I had a paternal uncle living in Toronto as a visa student. He had stayed after the war, he had to stay. So I guess a big reason was family first. Life would have been easy for my father in the U.S., but family first, and we came to Toronto. He decided to pick Toronto over Montreal because he believed that English would have been an easier pathway for the family. So we stayed in Toronto ever since.
How long were you at Camp Pendleton for?
I think for about 2 weeks. I don't remember the exact days, but it was about 2 weeks, yeah.
What were your memories of that time?
More army camp, without the beach this time. Again, with my own family, my own parents, I was not stressed. Certainly my brothers were younger than I, and we were not stressed at all. For about 2 weeks, and then we moved forward to Toronto. So when we came to Toronto, it was the end of July. We stayed in a hotel in downtown Toronto around the same time as Caribana. So that was my very first experience of Caribana in Toronto. Very colorful, very lively, very massive, with all these people smiling and dancing on the streets. So, and mind you, non-Asian looking people. Right? Before that, I did not see, or I did not get exposed to many non-Vietnamese people. My dad was in the Navy, so I met few Americans when we were on his ships, but true exposure to non-Vietnamese people was in Toronto.
So that was your first impression of Toronto, was just a lively festival scene.
Mm-hmm. And living in the hotel, I guess the news of Vietnamese refugee probably had reached Canada at that time. So my first experience with a blonde person was also in Toronto. We were living in an older hotel, so the elevator needed to be manned by an actual person to man the elevator. Had one of those older elevators where you have to pull the gate to close the elevator, and then turn the whole switch on for the elevator to be functional. So the person who manned this elevator was a young man, long blonde hair, of Polish Canadian origin, and we actually kept in touch with his family and his mother. They were working in the hotel at the same time, and we kept in touch with them for quite some time. So that was our first Canadian friend these blonde-looking young man and his mother and father.
How did you guys become friends?
I guess he was quite friendly, so he gave us Coke cans. So it was natural then, you know. I mean, all kids are very friendly, and so through the kids and his family were quite welcoming. So we kept in touch and we became friends. Yeah.
You were you came as a government sponsor.
I would think so, because my only relative in Toronto was my paternal uncle, and he was a visa student. So most likely we came to Canada at that time as a government-sponsored refugees. I remember my dad telling me that our airfare from California to Toronto, we were responsible. So we had to return the cost of the airfare back to the government. And we were, I think, assisted by some government program for several months afterward. Yeah.
Do you remember what kind of help the government gave you?
I would not be able to tell you that, yeah. So we were living in the hotel for quite several weeks. I think we were given a stipend to buy our food. The hotel that we were living in was quite close to Chinatown, the old Chinatown at that time. So I remember walking to Chinatown, buying the chicken wings and buying rice cookers, and my mom would actually cook in the hotel, and there were many chicken wings and rice within the confinement of the hotel.
And chicken wings were cheap then, like they were not the
Yes.
delicatessens that they are now.
Yes, exactly. At that time, Toronto did not think much of chicken wings at that time, so chicken wing was probably quite affordable at that time. Yeah.
And what happened next? Tell us about your first year integrating, settling in.
Could I go back a little bit? Talking about the days on the tankers. I forgot to mention, this might be significant. So when we were on the Vietnamese battleships, there were many people. But when we were moved forward to those commercial tankers, there were even more people. So if you can imagine, families after family would be lining up to each other on the deck, inside the hull, and there were people everywhere. There were no cushiony mattresses, so we were sleeping on just simple paper-thin type of coverage. And imagine all these people, where would the bathroom be? So makeshift bathroom would be constructed along the railing of the tankers. So we would do our businesses right there on the sides of these tankers for several days, from the Philippines to Guam Islands. So I remember that initially I was quite scared stepping onto these makeshift bathrooms.
They're like
wooden planks
set
and
out to sea.
set out to sea, and then can see down and you can see the water high. You know, we were high above the water.
Anything to hold on to?
Just the protective railing around the makeshift, but no other. You know, I mean, we cannot construct anything to.
So you hold on to the railing while standing on a plank.
Yeah, yeah. So I remember that, and food was scarce for all those people. So we were using army rations for all these people. So obviously everything was in cans and dehydrated, would become food when you add water. no fresh, meat or produce of any kind. So we were on these tankers for several days. We came to the warm island. That's when we would have fresh food. Again, all these eggs for breakfast would be those dehydrated type that you would have for the usual army people. But fresh apples and oranges and raisin, that would be fresh. Yeah.
You were living side by side with American troops at the time too?
No, they would be housed in different section of the camp. Vietnamese refugee would be in a different portion of the camp. Yeah.
Were you allowed to roam around on the island and get your own,
from the camp to the beach, yes, but not outside the confinement of the army camp. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so going back up to
Canada
back
now.
to Canada.
Okay. So that hotel now, I can remember exactly where it was. Front Street and University. That hotel was torn down eventually, so it no longer existed. But that location was quite fond to me from that very first memories. So University apparently became one of my favorite streets in Toronto. I did all my schooling near University as well. So moving forward, we were moved to a different hotel, and eventually my parents would have to look for housing. So we left without any financial asset. We left everything back in Saigon. So with the given stipend, my dad's and my mom would have to look for rental homes and support ourselves with whatever money that they were given. So I'm sure for my parents, it's quite traumatic. But again, life for the kids were easy. Everything was taken care of, no worries. All we had to do was to learn English. I spoke not a word of English back then. Summer was in Toronto, July. So we went to summer school, we picked up English, and when September came, my parent basically threw us into the school system with the same grade. So I was in grade 6, so my parent, with their wisdom, pushed me forward into grade 7. So it was not that hard. The language was hard, but kids pick up language so easily. So I'm very thankful that I did not lose any years from an educational point of view.
You were in school with the mainstream, not in the ESL stream.
Yes. So that was somewhat difficult, quite shocked, because I had several weeks of English classes. It's not enough to converse in the mainstream school, but the teacher was quite helpful and quite patient. Math was not a problem because English was not needed, but I would say I struggled with English for a good year, maybe a year and a half, before I felt comfortable with the schooling system. Yeah.
Where were you living?
In Toronto, we were living in the east part of Toronto. Our very first rental home was on Greenwood Avenue, north of Danforth. So that's where we were living in our first Toronto neighborhood. Subsequent to that, we went to a local Catholic school in the region. And eventually after that, with a couple more rental homes, eventually we settled in the southern part of Toronto in the beaches area. And my high school was Neil McNeil High School on Victoria Park and near Kingston Road. So that's, and schooling was a little bit different. In Vietnam, we went up to grade 12. In Toronto at that time, in Ontario, we went up to grade 13. So, so I did all my high school years in New McNeil. And eventually, a lot of my friends went to University of Toronto, so I did the same, you know, without really realizing that University of Toronto was a good choice for me. Yeah.
How long did it take for your parents to find their first jobs?
I would say they had to find it pretty quickly. I don't remember the exact number of months. They did have some retraining. My mom was a teacher back home, a Vietnamese language school. So, and she did not speak English. She spoke only French. So she had some English classes, and eventually was retrained as a hairdresser. And eventually she worked in a hair salon. My dad was in the Navy. Initially, there were many. It would have been quite easy for him to work on transport ships along the St. Lawrence Canal system, but that would mean many days away from his family. So he actually, I think he might have worked as a captain in Canada for a week or two, but he decided that was not good for the family. So he had retraining courses as an engineer, and eventually worked in the hospital system. And he retired from the Hospital Association group. Yeah.
He was an engineer.
I'm not sure what quite the name of. I think it was called stationary engineer, perhaps. Looking after the furnace system within the hospital. So that's how he worked in the hospital system. Yeah. So I mean, further training as a university trained engineer would have mean a lot more days, and there would be many days without food. So he decided the quickest way to make money and to support his wife and 4 boys would have been some quick training and to put food on the table. Yeah.
They went to. They did their retraining in the daytime or the nighttime?
In the daytime. You know, I mean, that would have been the quickest way. I don't know the actual durations of weeks or months, but it was in the daytime. Yeah.
And your mom remained a hairdresser for much of her life?
Until she retired, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to add about your integration?
I guess that would be it. You know, the schooling system, the grade 13, and then university. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What were the obstacles and challenges that you faced as you settled in?
My initial difficulty was obviously English. I spoke not a word of English. I went to Lake Wedon and I had a stronger French background. So for the first year, it was not an easy thing, but English was much easier to pick up than French. So eventually, by the time I reached the end of grade 8, my English was quite functional, and we moved forward to a Canadian high school. From what I was told, New McNeil High School was a tough school, a tough academic school, and I was able to do okay. So at the end, from my own personal experience, math and sciences were easy for me. French was also easy because I had more training than most of my Canadian friends. So I did quite well. My parents were quite surprised when they came to my graduations because I don't really talk about school to my parents. But I'm the type of person who did not need to be encouraged to do well in school. I was independent that way. So my parents were quite surprised, pleasantly surprised, when they walked into the school, seeing my name on the honor roll. I did not think that was such a big deal for them, but they told me, and I was quite touched that, wow, I was able to make them proud, you know.
What did you go to university in?
Okay, sorry.
Sorry about that.
It's quite interesting. I was good in math. I did well in school. I think in the memory of my parents, I was top of everything. I not saying it for boasting, but in the memory of my parents. Okay, so I was good in math, but most Vietnamese would have gone on to engineering school. Most of my uncle and aunts were in engineering school, but I like math enough, I like science enough, but I didn't know what to do, so I opted to go to Faculty of Art and Science. Medicine was not on my mind. I did not know what I wanted to do, So I went to the Faculty of Art and Science in University of Toronto at St. George, downtown campus. And I guess subconsciously I might have known what I wanted to do, but I did not want to say it consciously because most Vietnamese parents would have a little pressure of their kids to do well in school. And I remember fighting with my dad. He said, well, you do so well in school, you should have gone to medicine, blah, blah, blah. And I told him, Dad, do not push me, please. And I hurt him for that. But funny enough, my interest in math and computer, I took a lot of math courses and computer because that was easy. It was easy to get marks. But funny enough, I lost interest in math eventually and applied to medical school after 2 years of university. I mean, Toronto is a big school. You don't know how good or how bad you are, right? So you get your marks back, you know that, but you don't know where you rank among your peers. So I applied to everywhere, to all the Ontario schools that I could, waited very nervously, very patiently, and eventually gone to University of Toronto Medical School. And I did 4 years there, not knowing what I want to be eventually because medicine is a huge field. So I actually worked as a family doctor for a year, a bit less than a year. During my training, I had kind of leaned more forward to surgery, to ear, nose, and throat. So after I graduated, I did apply to get into head and neck surgery, otolaryngology is the older term. not knowing where I would land. Um, Cardiovascular surgery was a second choice, but I like ENT better. But I did work as a family doctor, waiting to hear from the school, and eventually I got into ENT, and they sent me to the school here in Toronto. Like to send their student out to get more exposure, more experiences from elsewhere, and also they would not have to pay for those years of early training. So I went to California, Southern California, for my general surgery year at UCLA. Came back to do 4 more final years of ENT here, and became a ENT surgeon thereafter.
And you did this with student loan mostly,
Yes. For the students of nowadays, they would not believe how inexpensive school was then. Imagine a medical school, 1 year at that time for me. I think it was about less than $2,000 at that time. So yes, I did have to borrow money from OSAD. My parents, they could not afford that. So my school loan was quite small. It was something like $30,000 for my 4 years of schooling, which is unheard of using today's scale. Yeah.
So I asked about obstacles and challenges before. What helped your integration?
I guess given a refugee origin, the only way, and also an Asian origin as well, the only way to move up in a society would be through schooling. To do well in the educational system was a must. So that was my motivations. And again, I'm more of an independent type of person. So the most the most competitive challenge would come from me. So I tried to do well in school for me, not because of my parents. Really, my parents, obviously, they had some words, but I tried to do well for me. I was lucky enough that I was able to cope with it. English was not that difficult compared to French, and surprisingly, English eventually became. I'm more at ease with English than French. So language was not a difficult problem. My friends were okay as well. There were all kind of people from different races in the school system, and we have our groups of jocks, people who are good athletes, and people who are more studious, and I was more or less in between. And I was an Asian boy, so most of my friends were of minority origin as well. So that, I guess, thinking back, that was my way of coping with things was banding together with people of minority origin who are more understanding of the origin of our past. Yeah, and up to this day, my best friends were from high school.
You also got really involved with the Vietnamese community.
Eventually, in my first few years, there were very few Vietnamese at that time. So all through grade school, all through high school, I did not see any Vietnamese students except my brothers. So when I got into University of Toronto, I was quite pleasantly surprised when I saw a sign one day advertising Vietnamese student associations. So I was quite surprised. and my Vietnamese was not strong at that time either. So and I'm a timid person. I'm more of an introvert. So, but seeing the sign, being Vietnamese, being aware of my origin, so I was quite excited of joining this or seeing these Vietnamese students on a Friday evening when school had ended. So that was the beginning of my exposure to Vietnamese students, and I started off early, 1982, and eventually one of the Vietnamese friends I became acquainted with got into medicine as well. So we came out as the third and fourth Vietnamese Canadian doctors who came out of U of T. And he's currently he's still in Toronto. So that's where I made many Vietnamese friendship. Some of it had lasted a long time, and I still keep in touch with them currently. Yeah.
So when did you feel that you were at home in Canada?
That's a good question because we were quite young. I was quite young, so I was able to adapt very easily. Language, I did have some time to become more familiar with it. But feeling at ease, that's a good question because I remember when I was young, coming to Canada, I was quite aware of being different. Not so much because of the color of my skin, but being different, even from my name forward. So initially, I was actually had wanted to have a more Canadianized name. Remembering days that, if you call it racial separation between my friends, kids, some are quite unfriendly, so many would have unfriendly words. Many would be very friendly. One of my best friends is a Caucasian Canadian. So I remember being different. I had wished to become more like them. I was not comfortable under my skin. But when I got into university, I became fonder of being Vietnamese. I became very proud of having a different name, of having a Vietnamese name. And seeing these signs for Vietnamese Student Association and meeting these people, even though all through my childhood I met very few Vietnamese people, but when I saw these Vietnamese Student Association, met these students, my Vietnamese was not strong at that time, but meeting them, I felt like I was more at home, I was more at ease. So that was the first sign of kind of feeling more at ease with my surrounding. And initially, thinking about it, I thought of myself being more Vietnamese. Now I'm older, I'm thinking more of myself as Canadian. But those first few days, if you ask me, I would have said that I'm Vietnamese, even though my English was stronger than my Vietnamese, and I adapt very easily to the Canadian way of life. But I would have thought of myself as Vietnamese first. Now, when I'm older, that had changed somewhat, but I still feel having a stronger tie to Vietnam even now than to Canada. But I'm a very proud Canadian. So I hope I want to carry that message through. Yeah. So with that, I did get involved in the Vietnamese Student Association. Eventually became the president of the Student Association for 2 years, and gave that up when I went into medical school. But I kept in touch with a lot of my Vietnamese friends. And when I got into ENT, into a specialty, I had to kind of cut loose or see less of my friends because time was quite short, quite demanding at that time. So after that, after my university or specialty training days, I would have to deal with student loan and life as an adult. So being involved in the community was not as prominent in my mind. But when my working days were more settled, I eventually became married, have 2 boys. I actually worked in the state for some time, and I returned to Canada because of family. And then eventually, I became more involved in the Vietnamese community. It almost came as an accident. Being a physician, I was approached to help with an organization to develop a Vietnamese Canadian senior home. After 40 years, the Vietnamese community did not have a senior home, and even up to this day in Toronto, there's no dedicated Vietnamese senior home. So I became involved in that organization. It's called Golden Age Village for the Elderly, and in Vietnamese it would be called Làng Dưỡng Lão. So that was my first real community involvement. And one of the member of the Golden Age Village was also a member of the Vietnamese Association Toronto. So he encouraged me to become a member of the board of the Vietnamese Association. They were lacking in members and people with some dedications to the community. So I became involved, and one thing leads to another. It pushed me forward. I mean, like I said, I'm more of an introvert. Initially, I thought of myself, I thought of Vietnam as, okay, we lost the war, we cannot do anything about it. Perhaps, we hope, that Vietnam would change with time, with economic changes, like East Germany, the Berlin Wall did come down, Russia turned into a different Russia. So I was hoping Vietnam would be the same. But eventually, that did not happen for Vietnam. So when I got involved into the Vietnamese community, it was one thing leads to another, and here I am. 5 years after, I am still in the Vietnamese associations. I was encouraged to become the president of the Vietnamese Association. So I had done that, and a lot of challenging days, and a lot of effort, a lot of patience and trying days. But I'm still here, and I think I'm stronger for it, and I'm very thankful for that. And more people had known about me, who I am. And I appreciate that. From that, and I think in my life, everything just things got revealed slowly. So eventually, from the Vietnamese Association, I got involved in the bigger organization. It's called the Vietnamese Canadian Federation, which is a bigger Vietnamese association, unifying different Vietnamese Canadian associations from Vancouver to Halifax, uniting the Vietnamese with similar goal, with the hope of improving Vietnam. And currently, I'm involved in that as well. We just had an election a few months ago. I was the president of the executive Ban Chấp Hành branch, And now I move forward to the board of director, president of the board of director, meaning the president of each governing member associations across Canada. Yeah. So yeah, I am quite surprised actually, because like I said, I thought of myself as more of an introvert, quiet person, and here I am. I'm forced to do a lot of public speaking speeches, and I still feel quite nervous standing in front of people, and so I'm quite surprised about that part of my life. Yeah.
But in that role, you are able to, I guess, talk and share the experiences of the Vietnamese integration into Canada and our experiences as refugees in Canada as well.
Growing up quite young in Toronto, I knew about the Vietnamese history from what I learned before I left Vietnam. So I knew the basic history about Vietnam, but what I know now, I did a lot more research, a lot more reading. Again, as I get older, I became a prouder Vietnamese person. I'm more passionate about certain Vietnamese goal. I would want obviously much more freedom and democracy for Vietnam. I'm quite passionate about that now. Before, when I was younger, I would have thought, leave Vietnam be and let them change over time. I'm no longer that way. I would want quicker changes, more evident changes for the good of the country. I become more, if you could say that, patriotic about Vietnam now than ever. Living in Toronto, if you realize the history, Vietnamese Canadians were able to raise the flag, the yellow flag with 3 stripes, for many years. And we lost that capability when Mayor David Miller came into power. He made Toronto the twin city of Toronto and Ho Chi Minh City, and he took the rights of the Vietnamese Canadian to raise the Vietnamese flag approximately for 13 years. So in 2016, Senator Ngo was able to spearheaded the Journey to Freedom Day, and subsequent to that, he was able to get the yellow flag to be hoisted for the very first time in front of Ottawa. And subsequent to that, the Vietnamese Canadian in Toronto were able to lobby Mayor Tory. I was one of those people. It was a very intense effort from everyone. And eventually we were successful. We were able to return the flag to Toronto City Hall in 2018. And 2019, just past April, was only the second year that we were able to raise the flag in front of Toronto City Hall. So I'm quite proud of that fact, that I'm one of those people who had helped to bring the flag back to Toronto. With my involvement in the Vietnamese Canadian Federation, we kept on with the flag raising in Ottawa. And with the lobby of Senator Ngo, now the yellow flag is raised in many cities across Canada. And Canada remains the only country where the yellow flag could be flown in front of government building. Not even in the U.S. The yellow flag, up to this day, is not flown in front of a government structure. So Canada with the strength of the Vietnamese Canadian community, we are quite strong. So I'm quite proud of that.
What does that mean to you? Why is that important?
The flag to the Vietnamese refugee is everything. Many people left with nothing. All their assets and homes and connections were left back in Vietnam. And the only thing they carry with themselves is the flag. So again, that flag is the heart of our people.
Years now, what are your thoughts of the life that you and your family have built in Canada?
I am grateful because if we had stayed in Vietnam with having my dad and my mom as a northerner who left for the South, my dad further fought for the South against the North, I don't think that we could ever go through the schooling system in Vietnam. I don't think that we would ever be able to raise up from that life in Vietnam. My dad probably would die in a concentration camp. They call it re-educational camp. I don't think my dad would make it out. And us kids would never be able to excel. See, we would be probably scraping, running in the streets, trying to survive. But here in Canada, I am doing well for myself, for my own family, for my own children. My brothers have done well as well. One of them is a dentist, another is a chiropractor, and another is a computer IT person, and we all were given a chance to do things that we want, living a free life, life with freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which I think you have to be a refugee. You have to live in a country like Vietnam to appreciate that. You talk about that to a Canadian-born Canadian, you would not, these Canadians would not understand that as well as I would have. So I think I'm grateful for my origin. I'm grateful for the life that Canada has given us. And then I think it's important to keep that in mind and to move forward with that in mind.
And what do you think about Canada's response to the refugee crisis?
The Operation Lifeline projects back in the late 70s were quite important to help some 60,000 Asian, Southeast Asian refugees to come to Canada. And I'm where I am, well, our community is where we are today because of that project. In Canada, in Toronto alone, there are roughly about 100,000 Vietnamese Canadian. So I think we owe it to future generations to open doors to other refugees. Without Canada's program, a lot of Vietnamese Canadians would not be here. There were a lot of objection to that as well. A lot of government officials had lost their government seat. They were not re-elected because they were in favor of allowing Vietnamese refugees into Canada. So it was not an easy thing. So we owe it to the future generation, to other refugees, to continue that Canadian spirit. Obviously, we have to make sure that Canada is safe. These refugees would have to be vetted properly. But I believe that Canada is a multi-cultural society, and we have to keep that Canadian spirit alive.